Following the Cold War and the collapse of the Soviet Union, the world seemed poised for an entirely democratic future, one in which all nations, from the post-Soviet Eastern Bloc to the so-called Third World, would see the social and political benefits of mass democratization. While such a trend did hold true during the 1990s and 2000s, today's world has seen, yet again, a movement towards authoritarianism, with a VDEM's report finding that 2019 saw the world return to a state in which democracy was no longer the majority government structure in the world. However, when analyzing the current state of democratic erosion, and especially when viewing the status of democratic governments on the African continent, Ghana seems to be an interesting anomaly. As seen on the measurement of Freedom House, the nation is a bright spot of green free nations in this ocean of surrounding partially and not free nations that pervade the African continent. A country that, while surrounded by authoritarian and unstable military governments, across the region has maintained robust liberal institutions, free and fair elections, and an organized civil society. Researching further, the democratic status of Ghana today was something fought for and hardly won over decades since independence, and an ongoing experiment in its most recent form since 1992. Such a discussion of Ghana's political movement towards democracy and the ever-present vulnerabilities to its democratic future allow for a comprehensive analysis of the standards needed for a nation to be considered a democracy generally, and how Ghana specifically performs in that regard be analyzed. By not only being able to relish but also criticize the health of democratic regimes like those in Ghana, is our current understanding of what conditions are needed to perpetuate and expand democracy's culture worldwide made clear, but also what criteria is needed to measure what makes a democracy at large successful. For my first criteria of the 4 essential standards I believe a nation needs to uphold in order for a democracy in that nation to be established, I chose to focus on the presence of free and fair elections in a country. Joseph Schumpeter, in his 1942 book, Capitalism, Socialism, and Democracy, defines democracy as quote-unquote, the free competition for a free vote. According to this definition, at its basest element, even the most minimal of democratic definitions as defined by and as seen in the electoral definition of democracy, involve the principle of free, fair, and competitive elections. Following this definition, then, a free and fair election can be defined as a nation's free vote or universal franchise and free selection of elected power between competitive political parties vying for control. Free and fair elections are the backbone of all democratic definitions in both the minimalist and maximalist traditions. Before the procedural, participatory, and social definitions of democracy expand upon the governing institutions within a nation and the social liberties guaranteed to the population as discussed in Professor Griffith's lectures, the centrality of elections, the ability of a nation to hold an open election process with competitive political parties jockeying for opposition candidates, and a universal franchise for all adult citizens able to have input in that decision-making process is a necessity. However, in order to evaluate the effectiveness and legitimacy of the criteria of free and fair elections in a democracy, we must measure this criteria via the peaceful transitions of power between elected administrations. If competition in a free electoral system is legitimate, peaceful transitions of power should occur more, because at its most basic core, democracy compared to authoritarianism must involve the expansion of political power and decision-making away from the same small group of elites. If the people are able to separate the will of elites and at times even actively go against the desires of elites to freely elect an oppositional figure without retribution or manipulation of the vote, is the most basic step of democracy secured. Moreover, more than just the institution of an electoral system being established and its results respected by the opposition in a competitive race, is the continuity of such a democratic system. Can the institutions of that country be relied upon to repeat the free and fair process of elections across time? And what institutional barriers are there preventing popular manipulation of the elected results? Therefore, the criteria of free and fair elections in a nation, measured through the likelihood that an election in which the opposition party is victorious will result in a free, peaceful transition of power, is the first necessary step in defining a nation as a democracy. For my second standard of democracy, I believe that a nation must contain effective checks and balances on the power of the executive. In order for a democracy to differentiate itself from an authoritarian regime means to standardize the power held by and excluded from the executive branch. By limiting the power of the executive branch through other institutions like the Constitution, legislature, and an independent judiciary, can the potential for the concentration of power to one individual, as it does in an authoritarian regime, be made more difficult. However, more than just the presence of checks and balances within a nation, especially those ingrained into a nation's constitution, is the actual implementation of those written amendments. The willingness of a government and executive to adhere to rule of law is paramount to the establishment of the diffusion of power necessary for a republic of and by the people to exist. Therefore, the criteria of effective checks and balances on the executive, measured through tangible instances in which the power of the executive branch has been limited or legitimized by either the Ghanaian constitution, judiciary, and/or legislature, is another crucial means in which democracy can be established in a nation. The fact that checks and balances on the executive can, in their most extreme form, result in the removal of an executive emphasizes the diffusion of power away from the top power and towards other direct decision-making of legislative leaders, who are the people's most direct representatives. For my third standard of democracy, I consider the strength of the legal protections for minority communities within a country. While a constitution may establish the strength of democracy's institutions, the people's guarantee for unconditional individual rights are a reflection of the government's unwavering commitment to democratic principles. When rights are able to be systematically or arbitrarily stripped from any population within a country, such action opens the opportunity for future populations to also be attacked, simply because a precedent for disenfranchisement has already been established. For example, as discussed in Professor Griffith's lecture, legal protections for the rights of pedophiles, or those accused of sexual assault, especially against minors, can be considered a key indicator of a country's appetite for democratic governance. Because if even the most despicable people can be provided a free trial, a fair trial, and equal protections under the law, a proper legal system has been successfully implanted within that nation. Therefore, when analyzing this criteria as a standard for democracy, the existence of legal protections for minority communities, as measured through pieces of legislation enacted by a nation's legislature on the topic of rights for minorities, is the natural progression for the consolidation of democracy in that nation. The protections afforded to minority communities is crucial as a criteria for the stability of democracy because the acceptance or at least tolerance of those different from the majority legitimizes other democratic processes like the universality of elections. The state has now successfully monopolized the legitimate use of force instead of mob rule. When the majority population of a nation is able to erase the civil liberties of any other group of people without due process, the ability of a nation to consider itself a democracy, even under the minimalist definition of free, fair, and competitive elections, becomes irrelevant. As my final standard of democracy in a nation, I look to analyze the general level of support for democratic institutions and democratic government amongst the population of a country. Many scholars like Christian Wessel and Ronald Inglehart in their article Political Culture, Mass Beliefs, and Value Change argue that further than just the presence of democratic institutions and constitutional provisions for the establishment of a democracy, democratic principles must be actively upheld and believed in by the citizens of a country in order for that nation to be considered a legitimate democracy. Mass belief in democratic principles, as they describe in their article, are the means in which democracy is translated into a structural form, from a structural form into an actionable one by which the population, such as with protests, petitions, and voting, can act. Only when the population believes in the promise of democracy as a liberalizing institution does a democratic government become legitimate. Therefore, for the topic of my criteria, by utilizing mass belief in democratic principles as the standard for a nation to be considered a democracy, measured through national survey data on the topic of how popularly the people of a nation support democratic norms, can we then determine a key reason for why democratic governance triumphs over authoritarian regimes. By transitioning my democratic criteria from simple guarantees on paper or legal doctrine in form to instead consider tangible results and dedication amongst the populace to living in a tolerable society, is the real test of a democracy made clear. Are the substantive results of a democracy's execution as robust as its founding documents claim it should be? More than just the listing of 4 criteria, these 4 standards of democracy should be considered individually on a spectrum when evaluating a nation's democratic performance. However, in order for a nation to be considered even a most basic democracy, it must first adhere to my criteria of free and fair elections. Next, for my other 3 criteria of checks and balances, minority protections, and popular democratic support, while a nation may perform very highly for some of these standards while performing in others poorly, all 3 other criteria in some form must be present for a nation to be considered a true democracy. A nation does not need to perform equally in each criteria to be considered a democracy, but the greater the legal presence of each of these other 3 criteria within a nation's governing structure or political culture, the farther its government moves away from the spectrum of authoritarian government towards the other end of total democratization, one that sees decision-making in the hands of the people, complete power kept away from the executive, protections for vulnerable communities established, and the people's belief in democratic governance solidified. When first evaluating Ghana's place as a stable democracy as evaluated by my 4 criteria, it must be said that Ghana's record of free and fair elections is quite impressive when compared to how recently its democracy was established. In 1957, Ghana was given a historic opportunity for change as the first sub-Saharan nation given independence from a colonial power. Ghana would then fall under the leadership of Pan-African advocate Kwame Nkrumah, who would serve as the nation's first prime minister and in 1960 would be inaugurated as the first president of the First Republic of Ghana. However, following a stream of increasingly despotic actions by Nkrumah, his government was overthrown in 1966 by General Joseph Nkrumah in a military coup. Nkrumah would hold power for 3 years before resigning as leader, enabling his successor to re-establish an elected government in 1969. However, from 1969 to 1981, Ghana would undergo a period of alternating control between military coups and elected governments, as individual military leaders jockeyed for power and failed to centralize their legitimate authority. Finally, however, in 1981, Flight Lieutenant Jerry Rawlings of the Ghanaian Air Force would ultimately overthrow a newly restored elected government and rule for 11 years as the nation's de facto leader, before his own move to restore constitutional democracy in Ghana in 1992. A new era of Ghanaian democracy would now begin under his rule, that saw a constitution re-established, ratified, and elections held. Since 1992, there has remained an unbroken chain of elected leaders to represent the Ghanaian government over the course of 9 elections, one every 4 years. The nation has witnessed the election of 5 different presidents, including Jerry Rawlings serving 2 terms, since the founding of the 4th Ghanaian Republic. And most importantly, 4 peaceful transitions of executive power between the 2 major political powers of the nation, Rawlings' own National Democratic Congress, NDC, and the oppositional New Patriotic Party, NPP. Every election since 1992 has been deemed largely free and fair by independent and international observers, with Ghana's repeated legacy of free and fair competitive elections having been the most important step in transforming Ghana from a country where democratic norms are considered transitional to one where democracy is fully entrenched. Peaceful transitions of power between different political parties has become a successful fixture of Ghanaian democracy. By not only allowing himself to step down and be replaced by his vice president as the candidate for his own NDC party, and even more importantly, in allowing for the successful election of the opposition NPP party in 2000, President Rawlings ignored and dismissed the intersection of the opportunity, incentive, and ability to re-establish authoritarian rule in Ghana, and instead towards one in which institutions of power like elections hold supremacy. However, Ghana's electoral system does face many threats to its continued legitimacy, namely the independence of the Electoral Commission, EC, the constitutionally mandated body of Ghana to process election reforms, as appointed by the president. Because of the 4-year elections are the main authority in determining the balance of power in Ghanaian politics, such a winner-take-all system is highly favored by the party in power, limiting their willingness to engage in any kind of election reform that could hamper their grasp on power. In essence, even if the EC has identified a key vulnerability in election results, or has engaged in fraud, corruption, or any other criteria that could result in expulsion, it would be in the vested interests of the president and his administration to ignore such reform or remove such an official, as such an act allows the opposition party the opportunity to pounce in the next election cycle, promising those same reforms. Furthermore, the fact that the political landscape remains dominated by both the NPP and NDC is something that is largely attributed to the financial barriers placed in front of new political parties before registering their party, totaling hundreds of thousands of Ghanaian cedi, their currency, to register a political party, and a few thousand Ghanaian cedi to register as a possible candidate for the parliament, insulating the ability of outside challengers to pose credible threats to the electoral machines that the NDC and NPP have become in the election process. The sanctity of free and fair elections will remain threatened if competition is purposely limited to only 2 parties. Secondly, when analyzing the current state of effective checks and balances in Ghana, we must further examine the reasons for why the abdication of President Rawlings was such an important point in the future of Ghanaian democracy. Rather than the decision to allow democracy to continue being of his own accord, the strength of the Ghanaian constitution in the 2000 election, barring President Rawlings from running for a 3rd term, was tested and reinforced as the ultimate authority on all legal matters in Ghana, legitimizing the Constitution's authority as a neutral document applying to all political leaders, and checking executive power. The willingness of President Rawlings to adhere to the 2-term constitutional limit of a president against the first successful oppositional campaign meant that the former dictator of Ghana did take the first step in consolidating Ghana's respect for the legitimacy of the Constitution's checks and balances. However, the future of the Ghanaian democracy was not determined by one man, but by how effective the Constitution was as a mechanism to limit executive overreach. Such an action consolidates the legitimacy of Ghanaian democracy with its first electoral challenge, moving away from the man who established the 1992 Constitution and towards creating a system that will and has outlived him, most importantly setting a precedent for future executives to follow. The elections of 2012 and 2020 also saw 2 important moves towards the role of the Supreme Court in establishing itself as a body meant to legitimize the democratic authority of the state. The 2012 election of incumbent President John Mahama was hotly contested, with the opposition NPP filing a petition to allege fraud in the election, with the Supreme Court denying such a petition. Such a predicament was repeated in 2020, yet this time with the NDC filing a petition of fraud against the NPP that was again rejected. These stress tests were crucial to ensuring the ability of the judiciary as the sole authority to check and authorize executive authority rather than the alleged fraud by political actors and elites. Such a respect for the established constitutional rule of law for how to manage elections rather than the parties resorting to violence to resolve political disputes is a key element of the strength of Ghana's democracy today. However, one current threat to the status of checks and balances remains the close relationship between the parliament and the executive branch. Under Article 78 of the Ghanaian Constitution, ministers of state, an appointed position by the president to his cabinet, must be selected from within the members of parliament. This means that the MPs of the party in power often have a vested interest in abiding by the demands and authority of the president, even if they personally disagree with his or her politics, as a minister of state is a much more prestigious and lucrative elected position compared to an MP. Such a dual position in both the executive and legislative branch largely stagnates the MP's ability to oppose presidential action or conduct their constitutionally required oversight authorities over the president, as any such oversight or future reforms could affect their personal power. This system has often stymied positive electoral change and presidential limitations from being introduced into law. Third, when evaluating the status of legal protections for minorities in Ghana, the rights of women and the LGBTQ community are an especially tenuous subject, and as such will be used as a key qualitative proxy for the overall health of minority protections in Ghana. Although the Constitution does provide for equality on the basis of a gender, women still face persistent struggles in reaching legal equality with men, especially when trying to achieve equal representation in Parliament. While bills such as the Affirmative Action Act of 2024 do provide pathways for equitable representation of women in Parliament by 2030, alongside more stringent financial and criminal penalties for private entities that do not abide by non-discrimination laws against women, such a bill has in one form or another been in legislative limbo for the past 30 years, with both political parties using its implementation when their party is out of power as a means to rally popular support, yet repeatedly failing to deliver upon their promises of implementation when elected. How the Affirmative Action Act will be implemented and enforced largely remains to be seen. Yet without the proper enforcement mechanisms, such an act will yet again be another lackluster government effort to address historic inequities faced by women. Next, it should sadly come as no surprise that a nation like Ghana, a highly conservative, majority Christian nation, grapples with the issue of equitable LGBTQ rights. In Ghana, homosexual activity is already a crime resulting in jail time. However, to go further in this discriminatory act, different versions of the so-called Human Sexual Rights and Family Values Bill have been repeatedly considered as a law since 2021, a bill that would criminalize an individual identifying as queer with 3 years of jail time, a prohibition on same-sex marriages, and especially with harsher 5 to 10-year prison sentences for any individual vocally supporting the queer community in Ghana. The fact that this bill was even considered as a viable political position and passed unanimously by the legislature, was constitutionally cleared to proceed by the Ghanaian Supreme Court, and even made it to the president's desk awaiting signature, is a key indication of the limitations for democratic thought in Ghana. Ghanaians at large seem to support the denial of fundamental civil rights to communities that are contrary to their mainstream religious and cultural views. Based on these two pieces of legislation, the strength of Ghanaian democracy under the criteria of legal rights for minority communities is tenuous. There are both movements forward and setbacks in granting full civil, social, and political rights to all Ghanaian citizens, especially in traditionally underserved communities. This uneven progress is a serious hindrance to the future consolidation of a more robust democratic future for Ghana. Finally, when measuring the general support for democratic institutions in Ghana, I chose to analyze the most recent round 9 and 10 results of the Afrobarometer regarding sentiments of democracy in Ghana. The Afrobarometer is a nonpartisan metric that measures the collection of qualitative data as a questionnaire across multiple topics, namely democratic health, governance, and quality of life. According to their website, Afrobarometer is an independent Pan-African research network that provides data on African citizens' values, evaluations, and experiences, comprising one of the most accurate databases of citizen satisfaction with their governments on the continent. Afrobarometer round 9 and 10 results are in its most recent publications, published in 2022 and 2024 respectively, and are key indicators of the public opinions of democracy in Ghana in the past 33 years since the Fourth Republic's founding. In its most recent 2024 publication, the Afrobarometer found that 72.8% of Ghanaian respondents still agree with the statement that, quote-unquote, democracy is preferable to any kind of government, a statement that has been answered favorably over 70% each time in Ghana since the Afrobarometer began collecting data in 1999 for Ghana, highlighting the continuously high preference for democratic government in Ghana as a key aspect of their national culture. However, the 2024 publication of Afrobarometer also found that an astounding 82.3% of Ghanaian respondents believe that their nation is quote-unquote going in the wrong direction, a slight decrease in the 78.5% of Ghanaians who gave the same answer in 2022. However, rather than signifying a dramatic improvement in the Ghanaian way of life, this decrease is largely the result of Ghana finally emerging from macroeconomic lending crisis that was at its height in 2022, emphasizing a return to the status quo rather than a comprehensive improvement of Ghana's approach to successful governance. When analyzing questions related to the health and stability of democratic governance in Ghana, similar trends can be found. When compared to past round 2 results of the Afrobarometer taken in 2002, 2022 saw a 54% jump from 28% to 75% of respondents who view themselves as being treated unfairly under the law, alongside an 8% decrease from 89% to 81% of respondents who feel that leaders should be chosen via elections, and a staggering 10% increase from 8% to 10% of respondents who believe that other methods of choosing leaders should be utilized given the often faulty nature of elections. These questionnaire results emphasize the complicated relationship that Ghanaians have with their institutional liberal governments. While the preference for democracy in Ghana does remain strong, as seen in the overwhelming majority of citizens preferring democracy over any other form of government, the decreasing rate of satisfaction in other metrics of democratic and economic performance can and already have demonstrated to Ghanaians that the existence of democracy alone does not solve other societal issues, and that other non-democratic solutions may be preferable. After evaluating Ghana's existing democratic performance, can an assumption of the future of its democracy become clear? While Ghana has a legacy of consolidated democratic practices over the past 30 years, this consolidation is threatened by the numerous electoral threats and constant pressure of political elites. However, especially when compared to other surrounding nations on the African continent, it would be disingenuous to consider Ghana an autocracy. Therefore, based on the threats and criteria I have already analyzed, I determine that Ghana is, in fact, a democracy, albeit a flawed one. This being said, Ghana's democratic future, however, does seem tenuous, with a major threat of democratic backsliding unless major reforms are undertaken. When evaluating the future of free and fair elections in Ghana, the necessity of election reform is the most pressing barrier to future Ghanaian elections, threatening the continuation of free and fair elections in Ghana. The Electoral Commission is amongst the most highly respected bodies in Ghanaian democracy. However, this body has been routinely criticized for its connections to the executive branch, an appointed position of the president, hampering its legitimacy as an independent electoral body. Having the ability to appoint the chair of the Electoral Commission, oppositional voices to the current administration and activists have often described the election process as being in the hands of the incumbent. While the ability to suggest election reforms does fall on the EC, when lacking the authority to institutionalize the electoral changes without the approval of the president and majority party, the EC becomes another arm of the executive branch. Actions taken to limit the power of the executive in electoral matters are largely ineffective without constitutional reform. Yet the party in power largely does not have an incentive to reform current presidential authority, largely because of the benefits that parliamentarians gain from the current system. Even if fraud did exist, a judiciary of Supreme Court justices appointed by the president and electoral commission appointed by the president would not be in any rush to halt such an effort. The opportunity for manipulation of Ghana's electoral system has not only been tested before, but without the suggestions of past election reform as recommended by the Supreme Court being taken seriously by an executive, future Ghanaian elections will remain subject to the whims of one person, opening an opportunity for continued disregard of election norms that prevents the future consolidation of democratic political culture in Ghana. Secondly, the patronage system of Ghanaian political system has been and will remain a thorn to the checks and balances of political power. Constitutional provisions themselves pose threats to the checks and balances on the executive, with the Ghanaian constitution giving outsized authority to the president. The Ghanaian constitution's preference for executive power gives credence to the fact that any future threats to Ghanaian democracy will likely emerge from an executive coup rather than a traditional classic coup, as a culture of an already weak, politically accountable system between executives and other branches of government just needs to be continuously ignored to challenges to his or her power. The further insulated the democratic process becomes in Ghana, the more of an opportunity an executive has to exert further reaches of his or her authority, as long as they make sure to account for the personal pockets of the elected parliament and their appointed Supreme Court. If this is done, what is there to stop an authoritarian leading president from steamrolling established liberal institutions? Next, by examining the future dangers posed to populations like the LGBTQ community and women in Ghana, can the future of Ghana's democratic performance writ large, under the criteria of the protection for minority rights, be evaluated? While it was not signed into law by President Akufo-Addo in 2024, another version of the Human Sexual Rights and Family Values Bill has already been reintroduced into the current 9th Ghanaian Parliament in 2025. Some scholars, like Dr. Joshua Zato, a political scientist at the University of Ghana, even argue that it was former President Akufo-Addo's unwillingness to sign the bill into law that was what cost his NPP party at the polls with a loss during last year's election. If limitations on the rights of the LGBTQ community in Ghana are popular enough to sway the results of an election, it is no wonder that similar bills of this nature would be reintroduced and popularly supported by the next legislator, even when that legislator is overwhelmingly dominated by an opposing political party, indicating that a bipartisan effort to marginalize the queer community into the future is popular nationwide, and are a potent political weapon to be wielded by politicians. The current President John Mahama himself on November 19th of this year said in an interview that if a bill of an anti-homosexual nature was passed through Parliament, he would sign it, as he personally believes marriage in Ghana should be between a man and woman. If Ghana's future performance on civil rights generally is represented by governmental attacks on the LGBTQ community, there remains a danger that other vulnerable gender, sexual orientation, religious, and cultural minority groups could face similar governmental pressures. In a nation where traditional gender roles are held in high regard, it would not be difficult to see an erosion of the hard-fought freedoms of the rights of women. And if the current Ghanaian parliamentary record for enforcing rules like the Affirmative Action Act are any indication of the importance that Ghanaian government holds for furthering the political and social independence of women, it would not be surprising to see this landmark act fall into obscurity. Finally, regarding the future of mass beliefs and democratic support for Ghana, the fact that the current projections of the citizenship's belief in democracy and its effectiveness as a governing institution have decreased over the past few decades is a cause for concern in future projections of democratic stability in Ghana. While the 2024 Afrobarometer results demonstrate that 72.8% of Ghanaians still support democracy over any other form of government, if larger and larger portions of the population plainly feel that the current system is inadequate to addressing current problems, or are willing to cede citizen decision-making authority to an executive who could end the corruption of the state, reestablish the legitimacy of electoral bodies, and move the population out of its current debt crisis, it seems like a growing minority of Ghanaians are willing to accept those terms. In order for Ghana's future of possible democratic backsliding to be averted, and the weaknesses in Ghana's current democratic system, broad-scale legislative, judicial, and executive reforms are needed. Luckily, Ghana's constitutional system does allow for the process of additional amendments to be made, a process that has already begun in earnest under President John Mahama's new administration. In accordance with his presidential campaign promise calling for reform to the Constitution, in January 2025, Mahama formed an 8-member Constitutional Review Committee, meant to collect public submissions and recommendations for constitutional change, a body that is expected to present its findings to the president within the coming weeks as of the writing of this paper. Mahama's new patriotic party actually now for the first time since 1992 holds a supermajority in the Ghanaian parliament, the constitutionally required majority needed to enact constitutional amendments. Given that this presidential term would be Mahama's last, there was little reason for him to ignore these needed calls for reform. However, for many Ghanaians, it is not just the political crises that are making their nation seem on the edge of decline, but economic. It is easy to see where the attitudes of discontent emerged with Ghanaian democracy, where the 2024 election results saw a voter turnout percentage of 60.9% compared to 78.9% in the 2020 election, an 18% decline of Ghana's 18 million registered voters who voted in 2020, indicating a lower level of confidence that Ghanaians have in the government as the primary body in which change can occur, or that their personal input into the democratic system actually has an effect on the political and economic future of the nation. By failing to address the key constituencies of the nation, most notably by failing to address Ghana's economic concerns amongst the younger generations, has allowed the potential for indifference for political action amongst the population to translate to widespread unrest and at its worst forms, possibly even popular regime change. Throughout this paper, analyzing the many flaws in Ghana's government, I still make the argument that Ghana is a democracy. Given the fact that Ghana's 9 elections since 1992 have been deemed free and fair, resulting in multiple peaceful transitions of power, secures Ghana's democracy in the most basic of terms and must be continued into the future, with some of the electoral reforms mentioned above for Ghana's democracy to continue. Furthermore, the fact that executive power has been made legitimate through other institutions demonstrates the power of the rule of law in Ghana, yet one that necessitates constitutional change to further limit presidential authority. Next, Ghana's complicated history of legal protections for minority communities, such as the current threats faced by the LGBT community, does endanger the future consolidation of democracy in Ghana, and may pose a great threat to democracy in the future. Finally, unless action is taken to address the underlying issues for why citizens are unsatisfied with democracy, the possibility for erasure becomes more possible. But, in a region where democracy has faced countless challenges and threats, Ghana's own path towards electoral democracy has been and continues to be in a difficult struggle, yet one that the people and politicians have been willing to undertake. As the West African region and the Sahel become increasingly hostile to democracies, the existence of a stable democratic government in Ghana that is actively interested in making the needed reforms to improve itself lights the path forward for all democracy on the African continent and beyond to follow. Thank you.